Hey, happy 2025. Hopefully, you had a fantastic holiday season. With that said, moving into the new year, there are some things that we need to talk about. And today, I want to focus on the Federal Reserve's fight against inflation. As you're well aware, inflation has been the key issue for the last 2 years, and the Federal Reserve has made it its mission to bring down inflation to its target rate of 2%. But if you look at the data, you'll notice a trend. And that trend is the closer the Federal Reserve gets to that 2% target rate when it comes to inflation, the more difficult and the more resistant inflation becomes to the Federal Reserve's policies. So today, that's what we're going to cover, and we're going to talk about how it's going to affect you directly, because it does. It affects you in the stock market, in mortgage rates, in loans, in pretty much everything that has to do with the economy. So let's get right into it. As always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get started. So first, the numbers. Before this most recent Federal Reserve meeting, the Fed had projected in its SEP projections that it was going to cut interest rates, or the federal funds rate, 4 times in 2025. After the most recent meeting, that has been revised down to 2. Now, what this means is that we're going to have higher interest rates for longer, if you believe the Fed. Some people still think the Federal Reserve is going to cut more than 2 times in 2025. I am not quite sure, because on one side, I understand that we have a debt crisis in this country and that higher interest rates for longer affects the federal government and our budget deficits. But on the same token, if interest rates are lowered too fast, we're going to struggle more than they already are when it comes to inflation. And when you look at the numbers, it actually shows this struggle in broad daylight. If you look at the CPI inflation number, it's actually up. It's increasing from 2.6 now to 2.7% year over year. And if you look at the Federal Reserve's favorite inflation metric, which is core inflation, that's not moving. It's at 3.3% with no change. And if you look more closely to this number, you'll see that as it approached the 3% level, it became more resistant to change. It became more sticky, which is known as sticky inflation. And if you've looked at my videos from 12 months ago and beyond, you'll see that I've been calling for this for quite some time now. It was very obvious then that as inflation came down, it would become sticky at some point before it hit the Federal Reserve's target rate of 2%. And that's simply because we have way too many inflationary pressures currently. And when you added to that the change in the Federal Reserve's policy, as in when they started cutting their federal funds rate, that only added inflationary pressures to an inflation number that was not confidently on its way to the 2% target. On top of that, when you look at the labor market, by the numbers, it's still very strong. The Federal Reserve said when it first pivoted and started to cut its federal funds rate, it said that it wanted to do so to protect the labor market. Remember, the Fed has a dual mandate. It wants to keep inflation stable at its target, and it wants to keep the economy as close to maximum employment as possible. So it said that it was going to start cutting interest rates because it felt like the pressures on the labor market were growing too much and that the risk was shifting from high inflation to high unemployment. But now, a few months later, what you'll notice is that the unemployment numbers haven't really moved that much, barely ticking up at all. Yet when you look at the inflation numbers after the Federal Reserve pivoted, you'll see that they have stagnated, or in the case of CPI, they've actually increased. So I guess what I'm trying to say with all this is that the fight against inflation is not done. And in 2025, we're only going to have further inflationary pressures. And some of those have to do with the new president and whether or not he's going to implement his 3 main policies, all of which are inflationary. We've talked about that in previous videos, but they are mass deportation, lower taxes, and higher tariffs, all of which by themselves add inflationary pressure to the market. And to add insult to injury, even though on paper employment seems strong and wages are growing, the average American, if you pulled one off the street and asked them randomly, would say that they do not feel richer. They feel poorer, which also begs the question, how accurate are these wage numbers, these employment numbers, and these inflation numbers from the BLS or the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And if we look at history, they do tend to revise these numbers negatively every few months, which means that the numbers that we are being fed today may not actually be accurate. Both inflation might be higher than they're stating, and unemployment might be worse than they're stating. And we're not going to know that for a few months until they potentially are revised in 2025. And that's another problem with this fight against inflation that the Federal Reserve has to deal with. They use these numbers to make policy decisions. And the fact of the matter is that this is a double-edged sword, because on the first side, they already are using dated numbers to make policy decisions, because if they're making policy decisions today and they're using last month's data, that's already dated. But then on top of that, if they are using data that then in the future is going to be revised, they really don't have an accurate picture to be able to make those policy changes. So in my opinion, in 2025, this is going to affect you and me in the following ways. One, we're probably going to deal with higher than expected inflation. That means higher grocery bills, that means higher fuel prices, and that means higher prices of assets like homes. And in response to that, the Federal Reserve is likely to only cut interest rates 2, maybe 3 times in 2025, but either way, that's still less than their 4 cuts that they projected, which means that mortgage rates, as well as car loans and credit card rates, but really mortgage rates are the big one, they're going to remain higher for longer. And you do have to understand that mortgages are not directly tied to the FFR. They are tied to the 10-year Treasury. But with some basic math, if you take the FFR and you add about a percentage point for the 10-year Treasury, and then on top of that, you add about a percentage point to 1.5%, you get mortgage rates. And if you look at the projections, the Federal Reserve is now saying that their FFR by the end of the year will probably be around 3.9%. So if you take that number and you add a percentage point for the 10-year Treasury, you end up with 4.9%. And if you take that number and you add 1 to 2% on the high end, you end up with 5.9 to 6.9% mortgage rates at the end of 2025. And if you look at the mortgage rates currently, they're at about 6.8%, which means in a worst case scenario, we won't get any change. And in a best case scenario, we'll get negligible or minor changes to mortgage rates. So for everyone who hasn't bought a house, I feel you and I understand. If you've been waiting for lower mortgages because everyone told you that mortgage rates would be lower at this point, some people even took 2-1 buy downs with the very much expectation based on their loan officer that rates would be lower. Some people made serious financial decisions based on that assumption. It doesn't seem to be coming true, which means that if you've waited to buy a home, not only are homes going to continue to creep up, but mortgage rates don't seem like they're coming down as much as we expected. And talking about homes increasing in price, you might say, how? Who is buying them? If wages are not keeping up with inflation, or at least they don't feel like it, and everyone says that they feel poor, who is buying these houses? Well, the fact of the matter is that even if we have less buyers, there's just so little supply. And until we equalize this, we're not going to get much relief in the housing market. And when you look at the numbers, we're underbuilt from somewhere between 2.5 million in a best case scenario to over 7 million houses. We're short that amount in a worst case scenario. So all in all, my outlook for 2025 is you're going to do great if you're invested in the stock market or if you already own assets like homes, because inflationary pressures are good for assets. But if you're the average American and your livelihood is directly affected at grocery prices or potentially being able to buy a house, it's going to be another tough year. Because if you don't already own assets, they're not going to get any less expensive this year. And on top of that, interest rates are probably going to remain higher, and inflation is not going to reach 2% or even a little under 2% like it would in a best case scenario. Inflation, in my opinion, is here to stay in 2025. And in a best case scenario at the end of the year, maybe we get CPI down to 2.4, 2.5%. And core inflation, I would be shocked if it comes to below 3%. So to wrap up this video, what can you do if you're just an average, purebred American? Well, you can try your best to invest as much as possible in highly diversified index funds like the VOO or like the QQQ to try to basically play the game, because these assets are most likely going to rise in value. So you might as well play along. And if you are in the position to be able to save for a home, perhaps the old saying that you marry the price and you date the mortgage rate might actually be good advice, because if homes keep ticking up year after year, you might as well lock in a good price to hopefully one day be able to refinance. With that said, we do not have magic 8 balls, and I cannot see into the future. So please do your own due diligence, not because I'm telling you to, but because it is the right personal finance thing to do. You should always be educated and research before these major decisions. But with that said, since we don't have a magic 8 ball, we're not going to know what happens until it happens. So we can brace ourselves, we can prepare, but these are my outlooks and forecasts for 2025. With that said, I do hope that you had a fantastic holiday season. And the beauty of this is that no matter what happens in 2025, there's a good chance that we at least make it to the next holiday season. And that in itself is a blessing. With that said, if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing broken down simply, you are in the right place. So I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.